console. But at the moment, we're focusing on the Amplify CLI. So working from our local development environment, building out our opinionated functions through the CLI allows us to actually integrate our application with Amplify and with AWS backend without actually having to we will need an actual a console login, but we may not be familiar with the console, so we can actually jump in and build our backend resources without actually having to get into the console, all by using the CLI. And then through the CLI, we can actually, and we'll get to this in a further session, we can actually host our application through Amplify, which actually does our serverless style hosting. So it's using the S3 bucket with a CloudFront distribution. And then if we set up a custom domain name, we'll have our Route 53 domain name pointing to our CloudFront distribution, which then serves out the content of our website, our React application, from our S3 bucket. We'll also have a future look at setting up our integration from our CI pipeline. So actually integrating our GitHub. So this code will all be available in GitHub, and later we'll actually show you linking our GitHub into our Amplify console, but that's more later when we get into the console. But now I want to focus more on where we started last session with the API library, or with the AWS Amplify libraries, and continuing to use the CLI to add authentication. These are, as I said, these are the use cases. So we work with in Amplify use case centric libraries, and which we also call opinionated workflows. They're designed specifically. We'll have a look at today the authentication workflow. They're designed for specific centric use cases, so that it's the common case or the common use case or workflow that you would follow when developing an application. So today we'll have a look at authentication, looking at the ability to sign up, the ability to sign in and authenticate, and get authorization to actually view and access the application. We also have, we can look at in future sessions, the data store. So working with authentication, working with API. As you know, when we set up our GraphQL API last session, it put a backing data store for us using DynamoDB. There's actually more we can do through AppSync with data store, allowing us to do offline data management. So when we get into offline first type situations where we want to continue to work with data, but we don't have internet connectivity, that's more helpful in a mobile-based environment, but we can still work in a web-based environment, allowing us to integrate with AppSync and allowing the AppSync synchronization to do the synchronization between our local data store and our backend data store. And then we can get into probably from there into PubSub. So actually using our GraphQL model to set up subscriptions, which allow us to generate or view the data as it's generated in the backend. So as something changes in the backend, it's pushed through to the front end instead of us having to make queries to see the update. So we'll get into some of that later. And then, as you can see, there are other opinionated workflows around predictions, interactions, and getting a lot more into AI/ML-based workflows, as well as notifications and storage. Storage, actually direct S3 storage. We can upload images. We can use images from S3. We can actually upload images into S3 and then integrate with our interactions, with our predictions, to do something like a machine learning object recognition, and then give us the like the tags of everything that it sees inside an image. So it's stored in S3. It's using predictions. It's using interactions, and then we can even use notifications if we wanted to send something out as a notification using, say, Pinpoint to send an SMS or an email. And then lastly, XR down there. XR represents both virtual reality and augmented reality. So there are libraries available for virtual and augmented reality. And as if you were along for the ride last session, the Amplify SDKs support both mobile and web frameworks. So on the top line here, we have Android, iOS, React Native, and Ionic, all for mobile. And then for web, we support JavaScript, React, Angular, Vue. There are others that we support, but these are the most common libraries. Now, getting back into the CLI, last week we took a look at Amplify init. So this is how we initialized our application. I will soon jump into the code and go through what we did last week at a very sort of quick high level to look at how we initialized our application, what exactly initializing did to our application. And then after we did our Amplify init, we actually jumped down here to Amplify Add API, and we added our GraphQL API all by typing in the CLI, Amplify Add API, following a few opinionated workflow prompts to tell us whether we wanted REST, whether we wanted GraphQL, how we wanted to authenticate. Remembering last session, we authenticated using API key. So we're actually still using a authentication method to query our data from the actual backend, but at this stage, it's an API key allowing anyone who has access to the application itself, because the API key is embedded in the application, to query the AppSync GraphQL API and retrieve the data. So today we'll take that a little bit further and we'll add additional authentication over the top of our application so that without logging in and authenticating and receiving authorization, we can't actually access the application and therefore make queries to the backend application. And then obviously Amplify push. Every time we've added something to the local environment, we've used Amplify push to actually deploy it and push it into our backend. All right, so today we're actually going to jump into Auth. Auth can be both authentication and authorization. So Amplify's Auth libraries come with a series of UI components, and these UI components can assist you to build out front end and back end. While authentication is a pretty common requirement, it can become a rather complex endeavor to achieve, right? So you need to follow workflows such as sign up and log in. You need to validate a password. You need to store them securely, and you need to send activation emails to users. Plus, check for spam bots. Like if somebody's trying to do a spam on authenticating or signing up to your application. When all of these are implemented in the back end, you also need to create the actual front-end authentication UI. So going through the sign up, receiving the email with the authorization code, putting that into a form to then send back to the back end, do your authentication. The entire workflow requires many steps within the UI, right? So for the front end, Amplify framework has what we call Authentication UI Components, and you can use these as they provide the entire authentication workflow for you. You can actually configure them to include components, sort of, whether you want username, password, and additional fields, or whether you just want username, password, or whether you want email. There's a level of configurability of the individual components themselves, as well as you can actually go and develop your own workflow if you've already got a workflow in your environment. You can integrate an existing workflow into your application. We'll see ways of doing this in terms of like how deep we dive in will be how much time we have available, but we'll see ways that we can do this in terms of, we'll start with the UI components. We'll then start to look at customizing UI components, then going into maybe doing a custom workflow, but then actually having a look at how deep we can go into working directly with the libraries as opposed to working with the UI components to build out authentication mechanisms, say a state for your application to see whether you're logged in, whether you're not, getting the user, any level of sort of data that's provided through Cognito back through the authentication libraries. So the backend is built using Amazon Cognito. So as I just mentioned, Cognito is our authentication provider. Cognito is a robust user directory service that handles the user registration, the authentication. It can also handle account recovery and other operations. It's divided into the user API and an administrative API. So you can present your application for sign up, so you register, you sign up, you log in, all of that stuff through your application. Then there's a separated admin API that you can use for the backend for administrative functions like assigning users to roles and groups, moving users, deleting users, and doing more administrative functions that are separated out from the application UI to keep a segregation of the usage workflows from the actual administrative workflows. The Amplify framework can also use Amazon Cognito multi-auth support, which was added to enable public and private controls. that you can mix and match multiple authentication providers for managed GraphQL API. So that's what we're looking at today. Using API keys is what we're using with Cognito user pools. You can even integrate OIDC providers. So there's going from what we call a user pool into a user identity. We'll have a look at a little bit more of that in a second. So let's look at Amazon Cognito a little bit more closely before we actually jump in and start working with it. So you can securely, you can secure and scale your user directory. So what I mean by this is Amazon Cognito user pools provide a secure user directory that scales from hundreds to millions of users as a fully managed service. So user pools are easy to set up without any worries about standing up, server infrastructure or hosting or anything in the background. It is a serverless managed service in AWS. So with Amazon Cognito, your users can sign in through social identity providers such as Google, Facebook, and even Amazon. If you've got an Amazon account through your Amazon.com, Amazon.com.au, whatever the other regional root domains are, and through your enterprise identity providers such as Microsoft Active Directory through SAML. And they're standards-based authentication, right? So Amazon Cognito User Pools is a standards-based identity provider and supports identity and access management standards. What I mean by that, that's the familiar standards such as OAuth. So we're using OAuth 2.0. You can use SAML 2.0 and even OpenID Connect. So if you're familiar with the standards, these are the three main standards that we follow. And then there are ways of integrating your own practices through extending with Lambda and other different types of workflows. So Amazon Cognito supports access control for your AWS resources, right? So Amazon Cognito provides solutions to control access to the backend resources from your app. You can define roles and map users to different roles, so your app can access only the resources that are authorized for each user. You can also have multi-factor authentication and encryption of data at rest and in transit. So that way, and we also adhere to different standards for the US, or I'm not sure if it's in other regions required, but the HIPAA compliance is a standard ISO 9001 compliant. So I don't remember off the top of my head all the standards, but if you get into the documentation, you can see the actual standards that we adhere to for encryption and in transit and at rest for a identity provider. All right, so let's move on. So as I said before, there's a slight difference between user pools and identity pools. So with Amplify, you can take advantage of these two types of functionality through Cognito. Cognito user pools provide a secure user directory that scales, as I said, from hundreds to millions of users as a fully managed service. So user pools are easy to set up without any worry for your infrastructure or anything like that. They're both, or the Cognito is the managed service. Your users can sign in through utilizing identity pools through their identity providers. So as I said before, you can use your Google, your Facebook, your Amazon, and then also your protocol-based providers. So if we're using OAuth 2, SAML 2, you may not have a connected direct out of the box or say LinkedIn, but because LinkedIn utilizes Auth 2.0, you can then use LinkedIn as your identity provider. The reason you would do so, a little bit into why you would choose one over the other, for say a front-end developer who's never worked with identity and access management before, a user pool allows you to create specifically a group of managed users. So a user pool is when somebody signs up to a user pool, if that's how we're using it, we actually create a username with a password and all of their metadata that we want to provide for that user or capture for that user, and then provide the options like multi-factor authentication, password policies, the user groups, as in what groups within that user pool do they belong to? Are they administrator? Are they a user? Are they a super user? Whatever your types of groups that you need for your application, which are backed by IAM roles, so identity and access management of the AWS account roles. So you've got roles for your groups, which then allows you to specify the access for different services based on those groups. So the user pool is a collection of users, right? And all of those users remain in that user pool. An identity pool, so when you're using identity provider, allows us to collect the basic information around this is a user, say the username, that we want to allow access to a application, but we don't need to collect all of that user pool information. We're allowing the identity to be provided by our identity provider. So we're now saying Google or Facebook or Amazon or whatever the identity provider that we want to use, you hold all the details for this user, and we just want to hand off to you when they're signing in. We'll ask you, is this who they say they are? So we're now relying on a third-party provider to say this person logging in is the person who they say they are, and hands back that identity acknowledgement saying yes, they're authorized, or no, they weren't able to actually sign into our third-party application. Therefore, we're not trusting them. They could be attempting to breach. But essentially, identity pool allows us to hand off the authentication to another provider to then hand back an authorization to say, yes, this person is who they say they are, and they should be allowed to access your application. So that's the main difference between user pools and identity pools. Today, we'll focus more on user pools with what we want to do. We're going to develop our own login for our blog application. So I'm going to jump into, you'll recall from last session, we have our very blank, unstyled application. We may, in between this session and next session, start adding some additional UI to it, because as you'll see today, we'll add some of the custom UI components, which will start adding more UI elements. But if Amandeep wants to help me, then we might together go and style it out a bit, make it look a little bit nicer, and start making it look like a blog that you might want to come and use. Hey, we may even end up using it as the user group blog hosted in AWS. But we'll see. We'll see how we go when we get there. We have our very blank application, because what I want to focus on is the functionality. Last session, what we did is, let me quickly bring up the code. I believe that's my other project. All right. So last session, what we did is we created our very simple application, which has some very simple pages. So we're routing to our admin page to allow us to create the blog. We're routing to our posts page to see what posts belong to a specific blog. We can add a post, so a form to allow us to add a blog. Essentially, all of this is routed to our actual pages. So if we go into admin, this was our simple add a blog. So we're basically creating a blog by triggering off, adding a name to an input and triggering our add blog function. That function is calling our service file. So we're calling in our blog repo service file, which we created, remember, from scratch. Before we had actually integrated our Amplify, I've still had it all commented out here to show you. We actually had our dummy data here, which was then being accessed directly by our functions that we'd set up. So we'd basically just run some dummy data through our functions to allow us to show the functionality. And then we went and added our Amplify libraries. We went and added our generated. If you remember last week, we did our Add API. We then, after we pushed it out, we then allowed it to generate our queries for the model. So let's quickly jump over to our model. We created our simple model, which was our blogs, an ID, a name, which has many posts, a post, an ID, a title, a content, and a blog that it belongs to, and comments that has many, and then ID and our comment itself. So we haven't really done anything with comments yet, but we have our link between our blogs and our posts. We push that to the back end, and then we allow Amplify to generate our queries and our mutations. So we've got our list blogs, list posts, get posts, create blog, and create posts so far as what we're using. from our auto-generated code, which is in our GraphQL folder here, which what it's doing is it's linking with the actual API library and constructing for us the actual GraphQL query. So this is the query. We could construct this ourselves if we wanted to, but because we have the model there, we've allowed the Amplify to generate the queries for us. We can go and modify these. We can add to it. And then we've linked it in our service files. Here we go. So fetch blogs with the API. So the API GraphQL here is our Amplify library, SDK. And then we're handing it a GraphQL operation, and we're just handing it that object that was auto-generated from Amplify when we created the blog. All right, so let's get more into where we're going with this now. So at the moment, when we do our query for our blogs, let me jump back over to that. We can go in and have a look. We created a whole lot of different test data. I believe at the end of last session, I had a bit of a bug, and I was creating stuff, but I wasn't seeing it show up. I found that the bug that I had was a syntax error. So it actually didn't show up. So you can see all the tests here that I was adding to see what's going on. Why wasn't it working? Right after the session, Amandeep and I went through the code, found our syntax error, and it was running, up and running. So we haven't touched it since then. So let's go and add another post. We'll call this session 2 auth, and this session is about auth. So let's go create an auth. Right, cool. Let's create that guy. We now have session auth 2. If we go back to our blog, we should see somewhere, here we go, session auth 2. We can now access that. Here we go. So I still have the ID up in the title, all of the ugly functional things that are there to show you how it's working. We'll start to back these things out as we go along and build out the application, but they're there just to show you how everything's working and tied together. So that's the post that we just created now. Let's actually go back all the way, and let's start looking at now. What we want to do is we don't want people to be able to come directly to the blog and just see it. We actually only want to allow users of our blog to view blog posts. Now, there's 2 different ways that we can go about this. Later on, we might actually expose the blog posts, and so the blogs and the posts. We might make some of them public. We might make some of them private. So there's some internal blog posts. There's some external blog posts. And then we'll show some RBAC controls around who can edit them, who can create them, and that. But today, let's focus more on actually jumping in and creating authentication. So before the last thing I'll say about what we've already created is I'm just wanted to show you what we've done now from the console side, because we didn't actually really look at the console last time. So I'm going to show you that, and I'm going to show you what happens after we've added our auth. So for now, when we go into our console, I've got a lot of apps in here for demonstration, but we're specifically looking at our Meetup app, and we're currently sitting on the development branch. So our environment or our stage is dev. You'll see that we have API here under our backend environment. As I said before, later we'll get into hosting and look at how we can actually connect our code through a CI pipeline. But for now, we're focusing on the backend and creating through the CLI. Later, we may even get into the Amplify Studio to show how we can actually create React components from Figma, import them into Amplify Studio, and then import them into our application. So that's probably something that I personally find very exciting. I'm not a front-end developer, so having something like Figma allowing me to create components, which then ties them to their data source, which then creates the React components that all I need to do is import like a library into my application. That might be something maybe members of the user group can reach out to Amandeep or comment on the channel if this is something they want to see. I'd be very happy to come back and run through Amplify Studio and looking at developing components in that way. I'm going to quickly just jump over to API. If we click on API here, we can see in the back end here, we've actually got some tables. We've got our blog table, our comment table, our post table, and then it's got some information around, pulling our current stage into our front end. What I wanted to show you though is we can actually go and view this if we wanted to start exploding out of Amplify or backing out of Amplify and starting to use services directly without running it through Amplify. This is how you can do it. You can actually access those resources directly. Here is our where are we? A schema. So the schema that we pushed up that we created in our front end exists now in our app sync. Our data sources are all connected to our schema. We can, if I go back here, run a query and say, let's actually do a list blogs, and we're going to get the name and the ID. We run that. There you go. We can see second blog, third blog, AWS user group. That's all I'm going to do for now. That'll set the scene for where we're going with the RBAC controls and how we actually add access control to, whether you have the authorization to read a post or create a post or edit a post. But before we even do that, now we're going to go and look at how can we actually turn our application into a private. We'll start with a private app. Now, if you remember, let me bring up my code. If you remember last week, let's create a new PowerShell. We're in the right directory. All right, so what I want to do is actually, I am going to stop this because it will create a few new things that we don't want to have getting out of sync. So I will run Webpack again soon when we want to demonstrate. But for now, basically, you remember last week we did the Amplify Add and we did API. This time, all we're going to do is we're going to add Amplify Add Auth, and we're going to go through a very simple workflow around what type of authentication do we want. So let me just pull this up here so we can see. We are going to select, at the moment, we don't want to use our identity pool. That's our default configuration with social provider. I'm not going to go through and manually configure everything. I'm basically just going to select to show you the bare bones getting started. I'm just going to go default configuration, and very good warning here, you will not be able to edit these selections after they've been created. So once the user pool is created and you've specified how you're going to log in, so whether you're using username, email, phone, whatever it is, once these are set, these are set. You can create a new user pool, but once this user pool is set, you cannot modify these options. All right, so for now, we're going to stick with the top. We're gonna use a username. In some applications, I like to use email address, but what I will do is I'll actually use username as the login and ask people to use their email address, and you can create some field validation to make sure it is an email address. But that allows you to actually have a username as an email so that it's unique, but also if you don't use the email field, you can allow them to add an additional email that then you can use for communication, as you may not want to use, you may have two emails for some reason. I'm not going to go into all the different workflow variations, but for now, we'll stick with username, and whether you want to use it as a string or an email, it's up to you. And that's all we have to do. So for now, all I'm going to say is, no, I'm done. I'm not going to specify anything else. And all I need to do is say, whoops, not just push, amplify, push. Okay, so what that has done for us, remember everything that we do in the back end, it generates in our local environment. So it has gone and created our actual configuration. I'm not going to jump into that because that's a little confusing at this stage. That's something we may look at later. But for now, you can see that it has created our local meetup user pool ID, and that's what it's going to go and push. So you can see that resource name, meetup 37cc00272, is the same as the folder in our local environment here. That's because it's gone and created it locally. It's generated that random name, and now it's actually going to go and push all of our configuration for authentication into our backend. So let's say continue. We know that that's going to go and push in. We have our API from last week, last session, and we have our authentication pushing up. How am I going for time, Amandeep? I don't see my clock.
Yeah, so yeah, we have 30 minutes.
Okay, we've got 30 minutes, great. So I think today we're probably only going to be able to cover off the basics of the authentication components. So we'll have a look at setting up the authentication workflow using the UI components. And depending on how long that takes, we might start to look at the custom authentication workflow or customizing the components. I think we probably need to start breaking these sessions into 2 or 3 hours, maybe. Or maybe I just need to come back a few more times and we can dig deeper. I would really like to know, and I'm sure Amandeep would really like to know, what do you want to see? So I'm going through basics of authentication right now and authorization. We will go through the UI components, but reach out through the comments and tell us, whether you want to see more of a deep dive on customizing your workflows, creating workflows from scratch. I'm very happy to come back and do another session just on authentication and authorization. It is a big topic. Or if you're happy with just the basics of using UI components and maybe some basics of using the libraries, then I'm happy to move on to the next topic, which will be our RBAC controls and data management. But let Amandeep know. Chuck your comments up on the video after you've been through this session, and we will come back and do what you want to see, as opposed to me steering the show. So we can see that this is now creating all of our IAM policies in the background. So as I said before, at the moment, when Cognito gets created for the first time, it's going to create 2 roles. It's going to create our authenticated role and our unauthenticated role. So it actually creates a role for, authorized role and unauthorized role. It actually creates a basic of auth and unauth, or authorized and unauthorized role, because there may be some time when you want to actually allow some public access to resources. It may be limited to what resources. It could be a Lambda function that does some sort of calculation and hands back some result to your application. But you may want to have a user group or just an unauthenticated user be able to access that function. So you can use that unauth role that's created in IAM to do that. But then when they go through and they sign up, they log in, they authenticate, now that they're authenticated, that's the difference between auth and unauth. But then when you start to create groups, you can create additional roles for those groups. So then you can add additional policies to those roles, so that you might say an authenticated person can see everything in one specific DynamoDB, or can see everything in one specific S3 bucket. But then people in the administrative group might be able to see, a couple of different resources, or they may be the only people who can have access to the S3 bucket, or people in the normal user group may just be able to view, so do a list on what's in the bucket, and administrators may have the ability to put, delete, update. All right, I'm just talking about that to buy time while we're pushing everything here. Now what I'm going to do is just jump over very quickly back to the console, show you, now that we should have an update here if we refresh. Why is it not showing up? All resources are updated in the cloud. Okay, so we should have our auth because it was created, but it hasn't reflected in, hopefully I'm using the right code source. We're on Meetup, yep. On Meetup, maybe it's just taking a few minutes to refresh. But we should have an API, we should have an auth resource show up here. I'm going to come back later. This is the console, but I do definitely want to show you that it's going to show up here to show that it's pushed in. It may just take a few minutes to show. Oh no, that's right. Sorry, it won't show up here until we've actually initialized it for the first time. I should remember this. Keep doing this. All right, so let's actually go next step. So we've gone and we've created our Cognito user pool. The next thing that we want to do is, we already have the Amplify library installed. So let's jump into the code and go over to our service that we're using, Amplify. Now, we're probably going to do one extra thing. Now, we can do, and probably where we'll go with the application is, we want to stick with the service model, right? So instead of everything having integration with Amplify across every page, we will actually go and add authentication to our. We'll probably create an auth repo. So let's do that instead of actually integrating it directly. So here we haven't actually imported Amplify. We've handed everything off to our what do you call it, pages, so our containers, and then inside our containers we're actually querying, where are we, home is probably the best one to look at. We're actually querying our service, right? So let's follow that same pattern, because remember, we want to do our inversion of control. So we don't actually want to say, if we swap out Amplify, then we have to go through and modify all of our pages. So let's start with our new service. Let's go here and let's call this auth repo.js. So the very first thing that we're going to pull in is the same as what we did with our blog repo. We want to pull in our Amplify library, our AWS exports, and our configure. So we'll drop this over here. Now, we're just going to do a single file repo for now, but later we can look at subfile repo, where actually we query Amplify library once and do the configure once, and then hold that in state, so that way every application that's using the Amplify will use the same library. So it's essentially is the idempotent the right word? I don't think idempotent is the right word. It's a singleton. That's the right word. So we want to have a singleton library so that we're using one, or we can do what we're doing right now. As every time you access a different service, it will then check the configuration, do the import, and then do the queries. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve with your application of why you would do both, but both of these will achieve what we want to do, and that's the abstraction away from the rest of our application. Because remember, we started with our application before we integrated with Amplify. We're not starting with Amplify and then building into it. So trying to do best practices at the same time as demonstrating functionality, because in the real world, this is what we would do. We would actually build our applications based on patterns and practices, as opposed to how things integrate. So we've got our Amplify. We want to pull in Auth, so the Auth library, which is what's going to give us the functionality to be able to work with Cognito. Let's get rid of home. Let's get rid of app.js, and we want to pull in our Amplify configure so that we know that we've got our configuration. All right, so we've got Amplify, we've got Auth, and the next thing what we want to do. So let's start with our pre-built components, right? So there's a little bit of a difference. What I'm going to show you for this application, for the UI components, is I'm actually going to import them at our app.js to show that we're actually, just to make it easy. But as we progress and build out this application, we'll abstract these away from importing directly through Amplify into the actual app.js. But for now, we're going to use this guy later as our service for when we get into building our own custom workflow. That's all set up. The reason I was specifically doing this file now is to show you this is how we access Amplify, right? Sorry, the Auth library is just call in Auth from our AWS Amplify, and that's it. So this guy here actually gives us Auth dot access to our credentials, functions to change password. We can do our own custom configuration for Auth. So we may look at that later on, about setting up your own custom configuration if you already have a user pool that you want to integrate with that you didn't set up through Amplify. All of the steps required for a workflow you can integrate with through the Auth library. So we can confirm sign up step. We can do the confirm sign in step, confirm sign up step. This one's probably the most important, is the current authenticated user. So this will give you the actual username and actually allow you to create a state. So if the user exists, then they're logged in. If the user doesn't exist, then they're not logged in. So, but we will quickly jump over to our app.js. So all we have at the moment is very simple app using routes and the browser router from React. And then we're routing to different components. So in the first thing that we need to do is actually, what we didn't do last week is we only installed, let's just double check. Yeah, we only installed Amplify, so we don't have our UI components. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our npm install AWS Amplify UI React. So that's going to add that to our dependencies so that we can start to use the UI React components. And as that's doing that, I'm going to, let's close that, jump back into our app.js, and let's import this, all right? So we've got, let's do it before our components. So we actually want to import a component called, come on, with, is it with Authenticator? I think it is, with I'm doing this before the library loaded in, so it's not recognizing it, but with Authenticator. Yep. And that will be from what we just imported. So that's from, that needs to be a string. From AWS Amplify UI React. So with Authenticator, just make sure, yeah, there we go. So it sees it now because it can recognize the UI React component. So very simply, what I want to do just to make this very quick and simple is I'm also going to import, this is a bit of a cheat, so take note because this is one way of pulling in, all right, let's just check where it is. One way of pulling in the styles, so I can cheat and we can add the styles, we can override the styles. I'm going to do it here. Let's go to our node modules, Amplify, where is it? AWS Amplify UI React. Okay, it's not there, so it must be under dist. Styles, that's the one. So we want, I thought I could pull it directly from UI React and it would recognize it. Let's just try styles. Let's make sure it's in dist. So we're going to pull it from, there we go, it did see it, styles. But we want the CSS file, not the JS file. All right, so that's just going to import a style sheet for when we build. That'll make it easier for using the actual component. Now, I'm going to do a cheat, and I am going to use our Amplify configure. So let's go, and we will back this out later. Let's get rid of our node modules. We'll back this out later, but for the purposes of just demonstrating very quickly, let's grab this and pull this into our, let's do it above. Oh, and we can't have imports after a function. All right, so just for the purposes of this demonstrating this very quickly, I'm going to pull in the Amplify library. I don't believe I need Amplify Auth. I just need Amplify library. So that allows me to point to or configure the actual Cognito. So this is all this is doing here is just pointing to the Cognito. Let's go and have a look. So it's added our user pool identity and everything here. Cognito, that's in our region. That's where it is. Now that you've seen all that, I will blow it away later and create a new one. But the Amplify configure is pulling in all of the information that the with Authenticator UI component uses for doing the authentication workflow. So for now, we'll just put it here, and then we'll back it out and we'll add it back into our authentication repo. But for the purposes of quickly having something to show, all right, we've got our with Authenticator. Now all we actually need to do is let's add the function needs some parameters. So we'll say function app. The two parameters that I want to explode are sign out and user. So this is what we're going to hand to our application. At the moment, it's not going to do anything. It's just there because I'm going to wrap the app in our with Authenticator. So all I do down here is at our export defaults, I'm going to say with Authenticator and wrap our app into that. So now what this is doing is when we export our default app, it's wrapping the app into our Authenticator workflow. So instead of, similar to how I'm doing this, I've added the browser router with the routes and the children. This is just another way of wrapping a component inside another component. So we're using the with Authenticator component, and we're wrapping our application into it. Now, that should allow us to actually, now let's save. What do we got? So with Authenticator, hopefully the styles will be pulled in. We're configuring here. We've given it the user and the sign out function, and we've wrapped it in. So we should be able to go npm run start. We should have the very basics for our UI component. Hopefully, whoops, that's opened up onto my other screen. We'll use this one when it loads. Loading. Okay. Error in app.js. What do we got here? So module not found. You're attempting to import which falls out. Oh, okay. Sorry. That would help if we actually pointed it in the right place. So why didn't anyone come off mute and tell me that I was doing it in the wrong spot? All right, so we're not going back a folder. It's in the same directory. So let's reload. And it doesn't find, the CSS. So let's try and access it directly. Yeah, okay, so I can access it that way. That's what I thought. All right, so let's see now. Here we go. We have, let's load up the other one that we had before just to show the difference. So now we have, and I can get rid of this one. Now we have, as you can see, a very simple sign in or create account. So it's tabbed component. This is our basic UI component. We haven't done anything, right? All we've done is we've added, let's jump over to the code again. All we've added is we've imported the UI with Authenticator UI component, and then we've actually wrapped our application in it. And what this is doing is it's giving us our workflow inside our UI component. So let's actually go and create let's use my email address. Actually, let's not use my email address. Let's use a username, and then it'll send to my email address. So let's create an account. Now it's asked for an account, so I'm going to just jump onto my other screen and open my email. And I can see, I'm not going to show you on the screen, but I've received an email that says your verification code is, and I'm going to copy paste that across. Close my email. All right, cool. And confirm. There you go. So I've now just logged in. As a part of the workflow, it's allowed me to sign up. And once I've verified my user creation, which is sent to my email address, it has then verified with Cognito, and then it's handed back the JSON Web Token for authorization, saying now this user has confirmed that they've signed up. They're also valid to log in. So we can now see the actual login. Now you'll notice we're back to our very simple application, and there is nothing here that's allowing us to log out or anything like that. So that's what we probably want to get have a look at next. So very simply, remember, where are we? I'm not on my code. We asked we exploded the sign out function, right? The sign out function from the actual with Authenticator app. So we can actually get that handed into our application. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add to, let's say, the top for now. I'm just going to add a button on click event, and it will equal our sign out function. So that should be a function, not a string. And we're going to just use our sign out function that the with authenticator hands to our component. And let's just call this sign out. Yep. Let's go back and have a look at our application again. And now we've got a sign out button up the top here, and let's sign out, and bang, I'm out again. So I can either create a new account, or this time I'm going to, if I can remember the random password that I created. Yeah, perfect. There you go. Not now. All right. So I've now just done a complete workflow, including sign up, verification, and log out and log back in again via our UI Authenticator app. And all we've added realistically is, in terms of code, we've imported libraries. We imported our styles because I didn't want to style it. But in terms of code, all we've added really is just our wraparound, our app, and then a button to sign out, and the rest is done for us. So that's the basics of the UI components. Now we can actually go ahead and like create the sign in, the sign up, the sign out, all of that stuff. We can do that manually using our Auth library. So that's the one that we created for the Auth repo here. So we can actually go and create those signups. We can go and create some components, so we can have our own custom components, or we can actually customize the actual the UI components themselves. So if we want to go and what do you call it, like change the fields that we see on the components, change like steps in the workflow, that sort of stuff, we can go and actually update those UI components to work directly with the way that we want our workflow. Maybe we don't want to capture, maybe we want to capture phone number and stuff like that. So we can go and add additional components. I feel like I'm probably running very short on time to actually get to the point of modifying components. So what I'll probably do is I will just finish off what we're doing today with adding some simple what do you call it, like demonstration of the actual user. So adding some use state. So we'll go back into our app for now and see where else. Actually, this makes it too easy. Usually, what I do is I go and do the manual stuff and then create the state for user. But what we can do here is we can say sign out. Let's make this really easy and just say sign out user dot is it username? All right, this may break because it may be the wrong property. Log back in again. Yeah, there we go. Let's actually take that out of the button, and all right, well, that took a lot less time than what I thought it was going to take, because now we're just using the UI components. But you can see now I've actually got access to the user from our with authenticator component. What I'll do is, because I can see we've got about 4 minutes, let's actually go and look at how we could do the same thing for actually working with our our Auth library. So if we go into our Auth repo, from here, let's just call this, let's cheat and easy word to make class, and we'll call this our Auth repo. Now here in our Auth repo, all we really need to do is we can create some state. So we could say, let's do here const there are a couple of different ways of doing this. just thinking the best way might be we just do, let's just do, yeah, okay, so const user. Is that not like that? I'm using TypeScript. All right, so essentially, I should be.
This is JS, Aaron. This is not TypeScript. This is a .js file.
Oh, you're right. I was wondering why it's looking a bit weird. All right, so let's just do var user. Why is it still not like that then? Let user.
What are you trying to achieve here, Aaron?
Global variable for the class. I think it actually has to be declared inside the constructor. .user, and then we should have access to authrepo.user. That's all I'm trying to do at this stage. If we go to, let's forget about user here, and then let's import auth repo from we'll need to export. Default auth repo. Then we can say import auth repo from our auth repo service. Then essentially all we should need to do for now, simple, we'll just say, I'm going to call it directly. This is not a good practice, but let's just do authrepo.user.username. Now, hopefully that doesn't break and I'm not making myself look like a fool. But we have some, yeah, it did break. Awesome. Cannot read app.js username. All right, so it doesn't like that object. All right, well, I've run out of time. What I'm going to do is I am going to clean up this code after this session and demonstrate. Essentially, what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is we can do the same thing as we did, instead of having user here, I'm just setting up a very simple, this is not what I would do in terms of following a best practice. So I'll clean this up and I'll show you actually pulling the auth user from the actual auth repo instead of, which is just going to be using the actual auth library instead of using our with authenticator user. And to demonstrate, that's how we'll get started with actually building in additional authentication controls so we can actually create more RBAC controls within the front end application, as well as in a later session, we'll also start to look at the RBAC controls for the back end. So now that we have an authenticated user who has access to what, so it will become very easy for us to allow people to access specific pages based on whether they have access to that from our model, whether they're allowed to create or mutate a record in our DynamoDB database. We'll also want to specify, well, if they can't create a record, we shouldn't actually show the form. So we actually want to show that in the front end application and say, if they don't have access to create a post or a comment or something, then just don't allow them to access that page. So that's RBAC controls in the back end and the front end. So today we've covered just the very basics of authentication. We've looked at the Authentication UI components. I thought we may have had more time to actually start to get in and looking at customizing our own authentication workflow. Maybe we'll come back and we'll do that in the next session. Please let Amandeep know whether that's something you want to look at. In the comments, ask us, where you'd like me to focus, and I can start coding out, whether it's customizing the UI components or building something from scratch before we move on to our RBAC controls. I'll leave it there for now, Amandeep.
Thanks, Aaron. That was really helpful, and thanks again for giving us time. Hope to see you again in our next session.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.